Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a platform from which we explore the paths taken by Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean, and we look at where the country is at present and focus on the potential of the future. Our topic of discussion today is environment and the law. We're looking at the process of ensuring sustainability and bridging the gap between these two very vital and critical areas of importance. To discuss this with us today, we have attorney at law and legal practitioner who is a graduate of the University of Colombo. He is a legal analyst at Verite Research, Uween Jayasinha. Welcome to Sri Lankan Understanding, Uween. Thank you for taking time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, George.
If we go back to the 80s and 90s, a lot was done in terms of environmental legislation. What impact did this have at that particular time?
Well, George, the thing with Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka hasn't really had a long history of environmental issues, and the current concept of environmental issues propping up is actually a relatively recent concern that has maybe perhaps dominated or come about in the last 50 years. This is predominantly due to the reason that prior to maybe the 1970s, Sri Lanka was predominantly an agricultural society, so development and environment was more or less harmonized. And even before Sri Lanka became a republic in 1978, Sri Lanka did have several colonial laws which protected the environment. For example, there was the Forest Ordinance, which was enacted in 1907, as well as the Flora and Protection Ordinance in 1927. So both these laws actually did have a level of environmental protection, and given that Sri Lanka was predominantly an agriculture society where there wasn't a lot of industrialization, there was, the issue of environmental damage or harm wasn't as prevalent in Sri Lanka as, say, in several other parts of the world. But all of that started to change in 1970, maybe like in the 1970s, when Sri Lanka did start experiencing a rapid population growth. And in 1977, as you are aware, with the change of government and the adoption of open market policies, Sri Lanka in fact had a growth in the need for resources, and along with it came a rapid industrialization, and with that comes the obvious urbanization. And with all these concerns, Sri Lanka did start having a lot of environmental concerns. And around the same time, George, is when the international community actually started advocating for environmental protection, and this was fueled mostly by the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, which brought about the Stockholm Declaration, which was one of the first international instruments that recognized the right to a healthy environment, and also brought about this concept, or recognized this concept of intergenerational equity, the idea that the environment shouldn't just be preserved for ourselves, but for future generations as well. Along with it came several other concepts, such as protecting and ensuring that protecting the non-exhaustion of non-renewable resources, as well as the maintaining and promoting of renewable resources. So there was a lot of movement, there was a lot of talk for environment, and there was a space for the growth of environmental protection. And as Sri Lanka was experiencing industrialization, there was in fact a need to protect the environment, and the Sri Lankan government at that time recognized this. And the 1980s and 1990s did in fact see a lot of environmental legislation come into being. So just some of the key legislation that came out during that period was firstly the National Environmental Act of 1980, and this brought about the Central Environmental Act. Then in 1981, Sri Lanka enacted the Coastal Conservation Act, which established the Coastal Conservation Advisory Council, as well as set up the Coastal Conservation Department. In 1992, there was the Mines and Minerals Act, which was brought about to protect Sri Lanka's geological resources and minerals, and also set up the Geological Surveys and Mines Bureau. And then in 1996, there was the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act, which set about the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Advisory Council. The thing with each of these laws is that each of these laws, while providing for management in each of the aspects in which they were dealing with, environmental aspects they were dealing with, there was also provision to make sure that development within these environments would be conducted in a sustainable way. So for example, if you were to take the National Environmental Act, any project or any development project had to be priorly approved, and therefore that the approval would be subject to conditions that certain environmental standards should be maintained. So in this way, there was in fact a sort of a balance between the development and the environment. And actually, one of the most interesting things that came about in 1993 was the enactment of the National Environmental Regulations in 1993, and that was of vital importance because it introduced the concept of a national environment an environmental impact assessment in Sri Lanka. So an environmental impact assessment is in fact one of the most vital tools that actually have come about in terms of protecting the environment. It was introduced to the world by United States in 1968. And it is now globally regarded as one of the most vital tools in protecting the environment. So for those of you who are perhaps unaware of what an environmental impact assessment is, it is essentially a tool which is used at the stage of planning a large-scale development project. And the purpose of it is prior to implementing the project, you actually go through a process of predicting any potential environmental impacts. You actually have a process of foreseeing, where you have through consultations and multi-stakeholder participation, you try as best as possible to explore all the possible potential harms that could happen, and then you also go on to exploring the ways in which it can be mitigated, as well as ways in which it can be you can come up with alternatives. So this was in fact one of the key things which actually made sure that development projects will in fact take into consideration the environment. And I think one of the most interesting and progressive things when it comes to Sri Lanka is that in the South Asian region, Sri Lanka is one of the first countries to introduce the EIA. So for example, India in fact enacted or introduced the EIA only in 1996, in 1994, I beg your pardon, and Pakistan was only in 1996. So Sri Lanka was in some sense a bit of the forerunner when it came to protecting the environment, at least in the 80s and 90s. But sadly, the environmental impact assessment framework was only introduced to the National Environmental Act. So where it came to coastal conservation, where it came to mines and minerals, when it came to fisheries resources, the environmental impact actually took much longer to be introduced, and that is in fact one of the problems in Sri Lanka that Sri Lanka did face.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned so many statistics. You talked about dates, you talked about the various forms of legislation that came into operation at that point. So the 80s and 90s, no doubt, were a very crucial moment. The world was recognizing the importance of the environment, and so were we, and we were on par at that point. And so when we come back with the Sri Lankan Understanding, we're going to be talking about how we updated, how we upgraded, or did we, as we moved forward, when we return with the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation with Uween Jayasinha, and we're talking about the environment and law, bridging the gap and ensuring sustainability. Before we went to the break, Uween, we talked about various forms of legislation that has been enacted in the 70s, 80s and into the 90s, which was very timely at that particular point in our journey. But when we look at it in a retrospective manner, and we look back at the past, did we update, did we upgrade whatever legislation we enacted at that point to make it more suitable for the current times?
That's actually a great question, George. So there has been some level of introduction of regulations. For example, there have been new standards set on air quality, on water quality, on waste management. So there has been some development in terms of the law and in terms of sort of inculcating better standards for the protection of the environment. But quite sadly, there has been, apart from that, any updating or any upgrading of the law or amending of the law has been rather slow. So one of the best examples I can tell you is that when it comes to the 1993 environmental regulations, which introduced the environmental impact assessment, which I mentioned was a crucial tool in protecting the environment, since 1993, that procedure, that regulation has not been updated. And at the same time, the current discourse or the academic discourse as well as the sort of the practical discourse on environmental impacts has sort of evolved drastically. For example, it's no longer strictly called an environmental impact assessment, it is called a social environmental assessment. So that captures not just the environmental aspects, but how society is affected by any environmental issues. So it takes into consideration things like how a development project would affect the livelihoods of people, how it would affect a community's ability to utilize certain resources. So it's a far broader scope. But though Sri Lanka, like I said, was a pioneer in introducing the EIA in South Asia in 1993, Sri Lanka has not in fact gone improved on this law and has not made our law align with international standards. So that clearly is a bit of a problem at the moment. And even like I said, even though in 1993 only the EIA was introduced only to the National Environmental Act, it took up until the late 2000s for the EIA to be introduced to other aspects. So for example, a project that would be conducted in the coastal region was required to conduct an EIA only after 2009, because that was when the law was amended. Similarly, when it came to any project that was to be conducted within 1 mile of a national reserve, which are rich in biodiversity and could have potentially massive environmental impacts, again it was only in 2009 that the law was amended. So you see that there has been a very slow upgrading process, and while we were pioneers at one point, we clearly have lost our reputation in that, and that is a bit of a problem, because as we see, Sri Lanka is taking on much development projects, and it is important for these laws to sort of be aligned with international standards and best practices. So my conclusion would be that yes, Sri Lanka has actually been quite slow in upgrading the laws.
So we were a pioneer at one time, maybe we fell short at some stage, but today when we talk about the environment, and you brought in this whole understanding of socio-environmental assessment, maybe we're bringing in the human aspect more, and the environment is suffering as a result of our doing such impact assessments, if you can reflect upon that, but also going to understanding where is the shortfall today. If we've done so much in the past, surely it only requires a certain degree of upgrading or renewal. Where are we falling short?
So George, I mean, just to give you share some of my experience. So with Verity Research, we are currently conducting an entire study on the environmental impact assessment framework of Sri Lanka. And it is, I think that is where one of the key places where Sri Lanka is in fact lacking in environment, because we see much of the environmental destruction that's happening being brought about because of development. And it is not that development shouldn't proceed, development should definitely proceed, and we should embrace development. But the problem is that we are doing it in a way without properly looking after the environment. And the reason for that is because our laws and our regulations do not strictly sort of require the necessary authorities to follow standards which are accepted globally, which ensure sustainability of the environment along with development. So at Verity Research, we were in fact doing a study on environmental impact assessments, and we identified that our regulations and our laws have three major gaps. And if I could just very quickly go through them, and I think one of the main things that is sort of hindering the environmental impact process in Sri Lanka is the lack of access to information. Information is, at this day and age, one of the most crucial things when it comes to accountability. The public can only engage, can only ask questions, and only sort of drive better reform if they are informed and if they are armed with the necessary data. So the lack of information significantly hampers any reform or any questions or any questions of accountability being raised. So what we found was that when it came to the environmental impact assessment process, the lack of information was significantly low. It is sort of a given rule that the environmental impact process has to be accompanied with proper proactive disclosure of information, meaning that as you conduct the process, the communities and the public need to know what exactly is happening. And we found that this was severely lacking. So for example, one of the key stages in an environmental impact assessment process is what is known as scoping. So the scoping is where you in fact invite the communities, you invite public authorities, you invite civil society, you invite academics and experts, and you sort of thrash out all the possible issues that could arise. And this process is extremely important because during this process there has to be a lot of information being back and forth. But the thing is, even with regards to when you have scoping, the feasibility reports that were conducted by the developer, or when it comes to what was actually discussed in these scoping meetings, what independent experts had to say about it, what the communities themselves had to say about it, that information is very hard to come by. And we at Verite have in fact done through multiple sources have tried to find these documents, including using the Right to Information Act. And we found that coming about getting this information is very difficult. So even for an independent organization such as ourselves, when it comes to actually assessing whether the process was actually done, there is no way for us to actually even find that out. So there is no way we can say, look, this is a particular area that needs to improve. So the entire system appears to be in a bit of darkness, so that definitely is a problem. Another issue is that the ultimate purpose of an environmental impact assessment is to produce what is known as an environmental impact report, assessment report, an EIA report. And this report would technically detail all the environmental concerns and all the measures that have been taken to mitigate them and to provide alternatives for them. Now, the issue is when it comes to an environmental, the public should be able to read it, and they are actually given an opportunity to comment on it. Therefore, you are creating a bit of a discussion, hey, what the public can say, okay, we know you've tried this out, but we feel that this is lacking. But one of the problems is that if you were to look at a standard environmental impact assessment report, George, it's an extremely voluminous document, it's an extremely technical document, and even someone who has been in, say, in the environmental, in the field of environmental studies for a long time would probably struggle to understand it. So the question then arises, how is the layman, how is an ordinary person supposed to understand this? So that again becomes a bit of a problem, because information, especially on the environmental impact assessment report, is not made available in a digestible form. You do have executive summaries, but I myself have read so many of these executive summaries and been left with scratching my head, because it is extremely technical. It is something that is not something that you can easily understand, especially if you don't have an understanding of the location, if you don't have understanding of simple engineering, if you don't have understanding of the laws. So again, even when it comes to disseminating information in an easily digestible form where the public can actually engage, there is a bit of a problem there. That doesn't seem to be happening. And a third aspect that we found where information was severely lacking was when it came to the environmental impact assessment report inspection. So like I said, when the report is published, the public is in fact invited to comment on it. So actually there is a process, a 30-day period where anyone from the public can actually comment on environmental impact assessment, and thereafter the developer is entitled to respond to those comments, and thereafter a technical committee would make a decision on whether the concerns of the public have adequately been addressed. Even this information, which is by and of itself supposed to be a transparent process where there is a dialogue between the public and the developer, and you actually get to see what the public authorities have said about this, information is not available. So we, for example, we really don't know what exactly comments were made by the public. We don't really know what responses were made by the developer to the concerns by the public. And we don't really know how the public authority actually decided to reconcile these issues. So again, there is a bit of a problem there. And given all these issues, there's a serious lack of information, and that sort of undermines the public's confidence in the environmental impact assessment. Even if I were interested in getting involved in an environmental impact assessment process, because of the lack of information, I would not feel empowered to do so. So we feel that is clearly a bit of a problem, and I feel that is one of the major shortcomings that Sri Lanka has. And second, one of the second issues that we identified was the fact that our systems don't really encourage the public participation. So if you were to look at the best practices or the best standards when it comes to environmental impact projects, it's supposed to be consultation oriented, it's supposed to be inclusionary, it's supposed to have multiple stakeholders, because the more information you have and the more concerns you have, the better you are able to forecast what potential issues would come about. But the thing is, in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, we have this understanding that when it comes to consultation, when it comes to public engagement, that it will be time consuming, that it is going to be problematic. And it is actually wrong to think that, because when you actually do have more public consultation, at least in terms of the environmental issues, you actually can prevent some of the issues that actually happen. So for example, one of the best examples I could say is the issue with the Central Expressway. We had planned it and we had implemented it, and then somehow it came about that there was an extremely rare endemic species of trees in the proposed path of the Southern Expressway, in the Central Expressway. And this, in order to sort of prevent that, Sri Lanka would have to expend approximately 8 billion rupees to implement the change, to make sure that these trees were protected. So that goes to show that when you don't have proper scoping, when you don't have proper public participation with the knowledge of experts, with the knowledge of people who are aware of things, projects actually face things like major delays, or you have severe environmental damage. So by actually getting the public involved at an early stage, you are actually preventing these things from happening. So it's not supposed to be something that's burdensome, but it's meant to be something that you're investing at an early stage, so that later on, once the planning is done and once implementation has commenced, you will have a better understanding amongst all parties, you will have managed everyone's expectations, tensions will be far less, you will have acquired local knowledge. So there is obviously many benefits that come about from getting the public involved. But unfortunately in Sri Lanka, the framework is such that the public is not strictly sort of encouraged to get involved.
Absolutely. And that's where we see, when we talk about bridging that gap, there is a lot to bridge between environment and the law. And when we come back with the Sri Lankan Understanding, on our next segment, we'll be looking at the whole process of ensuring sustainability as we go forward, as we look at the environment and the law here on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation with Uween Jayasinha, and we're talking about environment and law, bridging the gap and ensuring sustainability. Before we went to the break, Uween, we looked at various forms of legislature, we looked at the shortfalls. If we look at the future, sustainability aspect, from a sustainability point of view, where do you see us going forward? How do you see us ensuring that the steps that we take today are going to be relevant in the decades ahead?
So I did point out several shortfalls, and there's a lot that Sri Lanka can learn, especially even if we don't want to necessarily emulate best practices from international organizations. There's a lot we can learn from some of our peer countries. Some of the studies that we have done at Verity Research, we actually compared Sri Lanka's standards with peer countries such as Pakistan, Philippines and Kenya. These are all countries which have similar economic as well as environmental conditions in Sri Lanka, and you would see that their laws are far more robust, and these laws actually do provide for better information disclosure, for more public participation, for more in-depth study of environmental concerns, and in order to making sure that development proceeds in a way that is sustainable. Like I mentioned at the start, we do have sort of an obligation to make sure that the resources that we have are not just preserved for ourselves but for future generations as well. And it's implementing these laws are not difficult, and I mean, Sri Lanka had, like I said, we were the pioneers when it came to introducing laws in South Asian region, and it's time, I feel, that Sri Lanka takes back that reputation. There's a lot happening in Sri Lanka at the moment in terms of development, and the development agenda is going ahead quite strong. And while that is happening, we also need to make sure that these laws are environmental laws are upgraded, and because laws do have a normative effect on society and institutions, perhaps with the introduction of better laws, there can be better implementation of the laws, and with that there can be better protection of the environment, and therefore have better sustainability all around.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you raised some very valid points there earlier when you talked about the whole socio-environmental impact assessment that is being done. Maybe we are falling short where we are focusing more on the humans rather than on nature and on the environment, and what we should be doing, because I think we are more reliant on the environment than the environment is on us. The environment is in control at the end of the day. If there's one thing this pandemic has shown us, it's that the environment is in control and can dictate terms to us, and we've got to follow suit. We don't have a choice at that point. So this is where the protection of the environment, preservation, understanding the environment, understanding legal implications of protecting it, taking it forward, ensuring sustainability, not just for this generation, not just for the next, but for generations to come. That is exactly what we need to be very, very mindful of as we go into the future. Thank you once again for joining us on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Thank you, Uween, for taking time to be with us on the show today. We've looked at the environment and law, bridging the gap and ensuring sustainability. Join us again on the Sri Lankan Understanding when we look at another topic, where we look at the past, the present and the potential for the future of the island nation of Sri Lanka. Thank you.